They told me I was serving the Emperor, but when I stepped inside the gates of Unit 731, I realized I was serving something else, something darker. I was just a 20-year-old conscript then, still clinging to the idea that my service was honorable. In training, they told us we were defending Japan's destiny, pushing back the Chinese, preparing for a glorious empire. But when my orders redirected me to Pingfong, near Harbin, no one explained why. They just told me to report to the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Guangdong Army. The name sounded harmless, almost dull. It wasn't until the truck rolled past the barbed wire and the watchtowers that I understood something was wrong. The place looked less like a medical unit and more like a prison. Guard towers loomed at the corners, their rifles always pointing inward, not outward. A stench hung in the cold Manchurian air, something metallic, mixed with the sweetness of rot. I'd smelled death before on the battlefield, but this was different, constant, inescapable. At orientation, they didn't talk about medical duties. The officer in charge, Colonel Sato, told us, "You are soldiers of science now. The Empire's future depends on your silence and obedience. What you see here stays here." You will refer to the test subjects only as Maryuta, logs. They are not people. They are wood for the fire of progress. Logs. That word stuck in my throat. I remember glancing at the other new soldiers. Some nodded without hesitation, eager to obey. I tried to nod too, but my stomach turned. I'd seen Chinese prisoners before, thin, broken men captured after skirmishes. I had never thought of them as equals, but I had never thought of them as logs, either. My first assignment was guard duty. They placed me in a corridor lined with iron doors. From behind them came faint coughs, whispers, sometimes crying. The prisoners, or logs, were kept in bare concrete cells. Men, women, even children. Their eyes followed me when I walked past, hollow and resigned. Some reached out through the slits in the doors, whispering words I didn't understand. I pretended not to hear. At night, when I lay down on the thin barracks cot, I could still hear them. The building was never silent. Somewhere, someone was always coughing, weeping, or screaming. Especially screaming. The walls didn't block it out. The other soldiers pretended not to notice, lighting cigarettes and playing cards. I tried to copy them, but my hands shook too much to hold the cards steady. The first week, I convinced myself this was just a prison camp. Hard, but not extraordinary in wartime. But then I started to see the smoke. At dawn, black plumes curled from the furnaces at the edge of the compound. Trucks would arrive during the night, covered with canvas tarps. By morning, the smoke would be thicker, darker. I asked another guard what they were burning. He looked at me, expression flat, and said, "Logs." What else? The smell of that smoke clung to everything. No matter how hard I scrubbed, it seeped into my uniform, into my skin. A sweetness that wasn't sweet, something that made rice taste bitter in my mouth. One night, I was assigned to escort duty. A squad of us marched 5 prisoners from their cells to the medical wing. 2 were men, 1 was an old woman, and 2 were boys, maybe 12 or 13. None resisted. They shuffled silently, their heads bowed, as if they knew fighting back was pointless. I thought we were moving them to another camp. But when we reached the wing, the air hit me like a wall, sharp with disinfectant, but underneath it, the same rotting sweetness. The officers didn't tell me to leave. They told me to wait by the door, rifle at the ready. I obeyed. Through the glass window, I saw men in white coats gather around a table. One of the boys was strapped down. His chest rose and fell fast, panicked. The doctors didn't speak to him. They didn't explain. One simply drew a scalpel. The sound that followed, it didn't sound human. The boy thrashed, screaming so loud it rattled the glass. His body bucked against the straps, but the doctors held firm. Blood spilled across the table. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The doctors weren't killing him. They were cutting him open carefully, methodically, as though he were a specimen in a lab. And he was alive the entire time. When his screams stopped, they wheeled on the next one. I don't remember walking back to the barracks that night. I just remember sitting on my cot, staring at my hands. They didn't have blood on them, but it felt like they did. I could still hear the screams in my ears, echoing, louder than any gunfire I'd ever heard. Over the next days, I tried to bury myself in routine. March, guard, eat, sleep, pretend. But the compound wouldn't let me forget. The experiments never stopped. Sometimes when the doors opened, I caught glimpses, frostbitten limbs blackened with ice, men coughing blood into jars, women swollen with forced pregnancies. Every time, I told myself, I didn't do it. I'm just a guard. I'm just following orders. But late at night, I wondered if that excuse mattered. One evening, as the winter wind howled across the Manchurian plains, I stood my shift outside the cell block. The corridors were colder than usual, frost gathering on the bars. From one of the cells, I heard soft singing, weak, wavering but steady. A man's voice, Chinese, carrying a tune I didn't know. The song was cut short by the sound of boots and the clatter of keys. A doctor's voice barked an order. The cell door opened. I didn't see what happened next, but the singing never returned. That night, for the first time, I dreamed of Unit 731. In my dream, I was the one strapped to the table. The doctors stood above me, faceless, their scalpels gleaming. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Only smoke poured from my mouth, black and choking, filling the room until I couldn't see the ceiling. I woke up gasping, sweat soaking my uniform, the smell of smoke still in my nose. I told myself it was just a dream, but when I stepped outside for air, I saw the chimneys in the distance, belching black against the stars. And then, from somewhere deep inside the medical wing, I heard it again, the muffled, ragged screams of another log being tested. This time, I didn't try to convince myself I was dreaming. I knew exactly where I was. I was in hell. They said we were soldiers. But every day at Unit 731, I felt less like a warrior and more like a prison guard in hell. Morning formation ended with names and numbers. Always numbers, never faces. The officer read assignments while the Manchurian wind blew needles of ice through our coats. When he spoke mine, a clerk stepped forward and clipped a red tag to my lapel. Cold room, he said, as if he were assigning me to sweep floors. Around us, chimneys sighed a slow, black breath into the pale sky. The cold room was a corridor of locked doors and frost-painted windows where the air itself felt hard. A metal plaque, polished until it gleamed, called it a cryogenic physiological laboratory. The men in white coats preferred another word for it, methodology. I learned fast that everything at Unit 731 had a method, and the method was always the point. They put me at a steel table with a ledger, a stopwatch, and a pencil. A doctor with a fox fur collar introduced himself only as Assistant Section Chief. He unrolled a canvas of instruments, thermometers, clamps, a rubber mallet, 2 atomizers, a ladle, each laid with quiet ceremony. You will record times, he told me. We are determining the precise threshold at which living tissue ceases to be useful. A guard team brought in the first subject, a young man, scarcely older than me, trembling in a torn cotton shirt. His hands were bound. They sat him on a stool beside a waist-high trough filled with icy water. The doctor nodded at me. Begin. I started the stopwatch. Another attendant lifted the subject's forearms and lowered them into the trough. The man flinched, clenched his jaw, then hissed through his teeth as the cold reached upward like a living thing. A third attendant dipped the ladle and poured water over the submerged skin in slow, deliberate arcs. The clock clicked in my hand. The rubber mallet tapped once. Testing. Not yet, the doctor murmured. Minutes stretched. The room's only sounds were the drip of water, the hollow tick of the clock, and the man's breath shuddering in and out. Steam rose where his heat met the air. Frost formed in clinging filaments along the metal rim. Another tap of the mallet. Now, the doctor said, as if he'd heard a note no one else could. They lifted the man's arm out of the trough. In the white light, his forearm looked like porcelain. The doctor raised the mallet and rapped it lightly against the skin. The sound that came back was not flesh. It was wood. I felt the pencil slip in my fingers. Time, the assistant said. I croaked the number. My voice didn't sound like mine. They carried the man's chair to a different station. 2 heat lamps, a bucket of warm water, a tray of syringes. We will compare thawing techniques, the doctor said. Record the onset of necrosis. He paused, then added, conversationally, if the gangrene presents too quickly, the data becomes complicated. I wrote what he said, the way a child copies characters he doesn't yet understand. When the first scream began, my hand kept moving, as if it belonged to the pencil now. not me. By midday, I had learned to separate the clock's tick from the human sounds it measured. I learned to breathe through my mouth against the smell of wet cloth and leaked urine and the chemical bite of disinfectant that never entirely hid the sweetness underneath. I learned that the fox-fur doctor preferred the mallet to the atomizer because sound is clear evidence, and that he praised me when my columns were clean and unambiguous. He said I had a talent for obedience. At dusk, they moved me. "You will assist in entomology tomorrow," the duty officer said, handing me a new tag. He saw my face and smiled thinly. "Be proud. It is the core of prevention doctrine. You will serve the empire." Entomology was in a long shed that rattled like a drum when the wind hit it. Inside were wooden racks stacked with wire mesh boxes, all humming. An elderly civilian in rimless spectacles greeted me with a bow so deep his breath fogged his lenses. "Welcome," he said in a voice as warm as tea. "We build soldiers smaller than rice grains." He led me past rows of mesh boxes until the air itself seemed to crawl. Fleas, tens of thousands of them, feeding colonies raised on rabbits and stray dogs. The old man showed me a black ceramic sphere with tail fins, so light I could lift it with one hand. "The WWII device," he said fondly, as if naming a grandchild. "When it opens in the air, our soldiers rain down." "Our soldiers," I repeated. He missed the edge of my voice. Yes. A single sphere can carry plague to a village. We mix wheat and cotton scraps in the casing. The fleas cling to them on the way down. Even a child will pick it up. He showed me a map. Red circles dotted river towns and market roads across Zhejiang and Hunan. Some circles had 2 dates written beside them. "Second dispersal, for verification," he said. I remembered the boy strapped to the table in the medical wing. I imagined his village, a winter market, a grandmother sorting wheat from chaff, coughing blood. The old man tapped a fingernail against the ceramic. "We are very close to a model that does not shatter on muddy ground," he said, pleased. My task was simple. Transfer flea-laden cotton into casings with tweezers, seal the tail fins with glue, write the code number in my ledger. The fleas moved like static on glass. If I looked too long, the world beyond the bench seemed to ripple. At noon, a captain in field boots stamped inside and tracked snow onto the concrete. "Testing this afternoon," he announced. "Live group. Protective gear issued at the antechamber. Small exposure. Low concentration. Observed symptom onset." I swallowed. "Live group." The words were out before I could stop them. The captain's eyes flicked over me. "Logs." They marched us to a low building with a steel door and 2 peepholes set at different heights like eyes. Inside the antechamber, an orderly thrust a canvas hood and a pair of goggles into my hands. "Keep them on," he said, bored. "Do not remove them under any circumstances until the all clear." Someone laughed. It sounded wrong in that place. Through the viewing slot, the chamber beyond looked like an empty storeroom. Bare walls, a drain in the middle of the floor, a fan in the ceiling. They brought in 6 prisoners, 4 men, a woman, a boy. The boy wore a school jacket with a torn pocket. He stared at the drain, as if it were the only thing left that belonged to the world. The captain lifted a small lever and nodded to the old entomologist, who cradled the ceramic sphere with both hands. For a moment, he looked almost tender. Then he placed it carefully in the center of the room and stepped out, sealing the inner door. The lever came down. There was a soft clack from inside the sphere, then a sound like sand being poured onto paper. The prisoners' heads tilted up, confused. The woman reached for the boy's hand. He wouldn't look away from the drain. We watched through the glass. I tried not to breathe, not because of the canvas hood, not because of orders, but because it felt like the air itself had become treacherous. After a minute, one of the men scratched his ankle. Another rubbed at the crease of his elbow. The boy flinched, slapped at his collar, then again and again, faster. The captain murmured, "Note time to first response." I said the number out loud. My voice sounded like it came from the bottom of a well. We kept watching. The scratching became frantic. Angry red pinpricks blossomed along wrists and necks. The boy began to cry without sound, shoulders shaking. The woman pressed her mouth against the top of his head and whispered something. A prayer maybe, though I could not hear the words. After a while, the captain raised the lever again. The ceiling fan spun up, humming. "Recovery," he said, as if this were mercy. The door opened, and orderlies in oilcloth aprons entered with long poles and herded the subjects down a corridor like livestock. Inoculation ward, someone said behind me. Observation. He made the last word bright with professional pride, as if saying celebration. Outside, in the gray of afternoon, the wind erased all sounds as soon as they were made. Snow stalked the edges of the yard in mean, thin lines. I went to the latrine, raised the hood, and vomited until the bile stung my throat. When I lifted my head, the canvas smelled faintly of glue and dog fur and the smoke that never left us. That evening I was sent back to the cold room to copy numbers from earlier trials into a master ledger. My fingers had stiffened in the day's work. The characters came out boxy, as if carved into wood. The fox fur doctor drifted by and tapped the column where I had noted a subject's non-response to warm saline. He sighed. "Such a waste," he said. "We must stop using peasant boys. They endure too much. It corrupts the curve." "Endure? They survive longer," he clarified, patient with my stupidity. "They ruin clean data. The chief wants reproducibility." He meant the chief of the whole facility, the man whose name moved through the halls like a weather front. Shiro Ishii. I had seen him once in passing, stepping out a car with a fur-lined coat and a neat smile that never quite reached his eyes. The guards had stiffened as a shadow fell across them. Even the chimneys seemed to hesitate. The doctor patted the ledger as if it were a loyal dog. "Do not worry," he added kindly. "You will learn to separate yourself. There is the work, and then there is everything else. Keep them apart, and you will sleep." That night I did not sleep. When I closed my eyes, I saw the boy in the chamber staring at the drain as the dust fell. I heard the mallet knocking a forearm like a plank. I tasted glue and smoke. In the dark, I pressed my fingers to my wrist, counting the beat the way I had counted seconds in the lab, and wondered which column I belonged in now. Useful, corrupted, or waste. Near dawn, a commotion rattled the barracks. Boots hammered the walkway. The door banged open, and a corporal barked names. Mine was first. "Up," he snapped. "Field validation. Dress warm." We climbed into trucks with canvas flaps that snapped like flags in the wind. The drivers took the northern road, the one that skirted half-frozen patties and ragged birch stands. After an hour, we turned onto a track, so narrow the branches scraped the sides. At a clearing stood a scatter of wooden frames like gallows, a row of stakes driven into packed snow, and several crates stenciled with the same black ceramic symbol I had held in my hands that afternoon. An officer briefed us briskly. Range tests for fragmentation grenades and blast patterns for anti-personnel devices. I stared at the stakes, at the loops of rope that dangled from them. The officer followed my gaze. "Controlled orientation," he said. "We verify which angle yields the most instructive wounds." They brought the logs out of a truck, 8 of them this time, roped in pairs. I knew without being told that someone had already taken their measurements, recorded their ages, the condition of their lungs, the clarity of their eyes. They were led to the stakes. A sergeant moved along the line, tightening knots with neat, efficient motions. His face was expressionless, the face of a man repairing fences before winter. "Positions," the officer called. I felt the world tilt, the way a ship tilts just before it rolls. My feet found the snow because I'd been trained to move when ordered. I took my place behind a shield of sandbags, picked up the pencil they handed me, and ready to time the blast wave, to note the arcs, the distances, the shrapnel embedded in boards set behind the bodies like measuring rods. Across the clearing, one of the prisoners turned his head and met my eyes. He didn't curse me. He didn't beg. His gaze was strangely steady, as if he were the one observing me now, as if I were the specimen pinned to a board. The officer raised his arm. The man with the detonator looked at him, waiting. And in that breathless second, with the snow holding its own breath and the chimneys back at Pingfong lifting their lazy black, the thought came so clear and cold it felt like a blade laid on my neck. We are not guarding them. We are being trained to guard the secret of what we are about to do, even from ourselves. The officer's hand chopped down. The world cracked white. You don't forget the sound of a man screaming while his body is opened alive. I still hear it, even now. The day after the field validation, I was transferred to assist in surgical trials. That's what they called it. Trials. Like this was a university classroom. Like we were students eager to learn. The operating theater was spotless, stainless steel tables lined in a row, gleaming under harsh white lights. It could have been any hospital, until you noticed the restraints bolted into the tables. Until you saw the buckets waiting underneath to catch what spilled. Until you smelled the iron tang of blood, faint but permanent, as if the walls themselves had absorbed it. My job was simple: stand by, record notes, pass instruments. Nothing more. But nothing could have prepared me for the first trial. They brought in a man, shackled and blindfolded, his head shaved. He walked without resistance, as though he already knew what awaited him. A surgeon in crisp gloves began marking his chest with ink. He didn't administer any anesthetic, not even a sip of water, just scalpel to skin. The cut opened a man's chest with terrifying neatness. His scream tore through me, but the doctors didn't flinch. One held the ribs apart with clamps. Another leaned in to prod the lungs, as if he were examining a specimen in a market stall. The man bucked and thrashed, blood bubbling from his lips. Note color, resilience, the surgeon said calmly. Observe rate of collapse. I stood frozen, pen trembling in my hand, until the officer snapped, record it. I wrote what they told me to, though the words blurred through the shaking. They didn't stop when he died. They carried on, peeling him open, labeling organs, weighing each piece. His body became columns of numbers, a collection of weights and measurements that would be filed away in a ledger. When I set the pen down, my hand was slick with sweat, though it felt like blood. Afterward, the floor was washed with a bucket of bleach. The smell clung to my nostrils, burning sharp enough to make my eyes water. The bleach mixed with the memory of his screams until I thought I would choke. That was only the first. Day after day, I watched them carve men and women alive. Sometimes they injected prisoners with plague or cholera first, then opened them up to examine progression. Other times they froze a limb until it was hard as wood, then amputated it to measure decay. Pregnant women were cut open to study the fetus. Children, too, strapped down, tiny bodies shaking as the knives worked. Each time I told myself, I'm not doing it. I'm only writing. I'm only watching. But watching became its own form of guilt. My notes turned their screams into tidy rows of words. Every stroke of my pen was another betrayal. At night, the barracks grew quieter. No one talked about what we had seen. Some drank until they collapsed. Some slept like stones, as if their consciences were long dead. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every sound, every cut, every last breath. One night, I dreamed of the man from the first trial. Not as he died, but afterward, when his organs had been laid out on trays. In the dream, he stood at the foot of my bed, chest split wide, eyes hollow, his lips moving soundlessly. I jolted awake, sweating through my sheets. The darkness seemed thicker than usual, pressing against me like the walls of a cell. The next day, I asked a fellow soldier, Tanaka, how he endured it. He was older, hardened, the kind of man who never winced. He lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly, and said, "You stop thinking of them as people. That's the trick. You let yourself believe they're just logs." "But they scream," I said. He looked at me then, eyes flat. "Logs burn. They crack, they pop. Same sound, different shape." I said nothing, but in my heart, I knew he was lying to himself. Those screams weren't wood. They were human, and they would never leave us. As winter deepened, the experiments grew more frantic. Word spread that the war wasn't going well for Japan. The Americans had taken islands in the Pacific. The Soviets were watching from the north. Tension sharpened everything inside the compound. Orders came down faster, harsher, as if the officers feared time was running out. One evening, Colonel Ishii himself walked through the theater. The man everyone whispered about, the architect of this hell. He was calm, smiling, his boots polished, his coat perfectly clean. He stopped beside the table where a young girl lay strapped, her thin chest heaving in panic. Ishii didn't flinch. He leaned over, adjusted a clamp, and said to the surgeon, "Proceed. Carefully. We need reliable data." And then he walked away, humming softly, as if nothing about the scene was extraordinary. When the scalpel sank into the girl's belly, she let out a shriek so piercing it made the lights seem to tremble. I felt my knees give. The officer beside me snapped, "Stand firm. Record it." I wrote, though my hand was numb. My pen scratched out the words, but my mind screamed louder than she did. This is wrong. This is wrong. This is wrong. That night, I didn't dream. I heard voices whispered in the dark, in Chinese, in Japanese, in words I couldn't understand. They drifted through the barracks like smoke. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voices seeped through my skin. By then, I realized something. Unit 731 wasn't just killing the prisoners. It was killing us, too, in a slower way, turning us into something less than human. And as I stared at the ceiling in the blackness, I wonder how long before we all became logs ourselves. I began to dream of the faces, not the ones on the battlefield, the ones that stared up at me from the operating tables. The barracks had grown quieter, but not with peace. The silence was heavy, suffocating, as though the building itself carried the weight of all the screams it had swallowed. Some of the men drank themselves into stupors every night, clutching bottles with shaking hands. Others fell asleep instantly, too quickly, like stones sinking into black water. I couldn't decide which was worse, those who could ignore what we saw, or those like me, who couldn't. Sleep became dangerous. Each time I closed my eyes, the faces returned. The boy with his arms submerged in ice water, screaming until his throat tore. The woman whispering to her child as fleas crawled across their skin. The young girl on the table, staring at me as the scalpel slid in, her gaze locking on mine, as if asking why I didn't stop it. I woke, gasping, clawing at my chest as though my own ribs had been cracked open. The sheets were damp with sweat. Some nights, I swore I could still feel the blood on my hands, warm and sticky, though I had never touched a knife. One night, I saw something worse. I woke to footsteps, slow dragging, across the barracks floor, past the rows of sleeping men. I sat up, heart pounding, expecting to see a guard or officer. But it wasn't. It was him, the first man I'd seen cut open. His chest gaped wide, ribs split like broken shutters, lungs shriveled and dark. He walked between the bunks, leaving wet streaks on the floor. No one else stirred. No one else saw. His head turned toward me, and though his mouth didn't move, I heard his voice inside my skull. You wrote it down. I screamed. The others jolted awake, swearing, throwing boots at me to shut up. By the time they lit the lamps, the floor was clean, the room empty. Only my sweat and the echo of that voice remained. After that, I didn't speak much. I became a shadow among shadows. I carried out orders, stood guard, wrote notes, passed instruments. But my mind never left the theater. Every sound in the compound twisted into echoes of what I had seen. The clang of a pot in the mess hall became the mallet on frozen flesh. The hiss of steam from the kitchen became the breath of the dying. Tanaka, the older soldier, noticed. He cornered me one evening, cigarette glowing in the dark. You're slipping, he said flatly. I can't stop hearing them, I whispered. He exhaled smoke, watching it curl in the freezing air. Then drink until you can't hear. That doesn't work. His eyes narrowed. Then pray you're never chosen. Chosen? I asked. He didn't answer. He just flicked his cigarette into the snow and walked away. That word gnawed at me. Chosen. I thought of the prisoners, dragged from their cells, lined up for experiments. I thought how the doctors never explained why one was picked over another. And I realized, soldiers, too, were only useful as long as they obeyed. If we cracked, if we broke down, if we refused, what stopped them from strapping us to the tables? The thought dug deep, a splinter in my mind. I started watching the officers more closely. The way they looked at us, clinical, measuring, like we were specimens too, just waiting our turn. One day, during a frostbite trial, the doctor asked for an assistant to hold the subject's arm steady. My stomach dropped when his eyes landed on me. I stepped forward, my gloves stiff with cold, and gripped the prisoner's wrist. The man's skin was already darkening, stiff and brittle. He moaned softly, too weak to scream anymore. As the mallet tapped, sending a hollow knock through the bone, I realized my grip was trembling. Not from the cold, from the terror that one day, someone would be gripping me the same way. That night, the paranoia bloomed. Every sound of boots in the corridor made me think they were coming for me. Every time an officer's eyes lingered too long, I felt my throat close. I began to imagine my own experiments. My arm plunged into ice, my chest pried open, my body dissected while my screams were dutifully recorded in some soldier's neat handwriting. I stopped eating. The rice turned to ash in my mouth. My cheeks hollowed. My reflection in the wash basin looked like one of the prisoners. And then, one morning, I heard my name called. The officer's voice was sharp, final. Soldier Nakamura. Report to the medical wing. My legs nearly gave out. The barracks fell silent. The others avoided my eyes. No one said a word. I walked to the wing, each step heavier than the last. The corridors felt narrower, the air thicker. The screams in the distance grew louder, though I couldn't tell if they were real or only in my head. At the doors, a surgeon in a white coat greeted me. His smile was small, polite. "We need you inside today." Inside. The words slammed through me like a hammer. My heart pounded. My mouth went dry. I thought of Tanaka's warning. Pray you're never chosen. The surgeon led me toward the operating tables. My vision blurred. Every face I had dreamed of flickered before my eyes. The boy, the woman, the man with the open chest, the girl with the scalpel in her belly. And now me. I gripped my rifle so hard my knuckles ached. My mind screamed at me to run, to fight, to do anything. But my body kept moving, toward the tables, toward the restraints. And in that moment, I wasn't sure anymore whether I was walking there as a guard, or as the next log. By the end, I knew the truth. The real prisoners of Unit 731 weren't the ones in the cells. It was us, the soldiers. Summer of 1945 arrived heavy and desperate. Rumors spread faster than any disease. The Americans had bombed Tokyo. The Soviets were preparing to move south. Everyone knew the war was collapsing, even if the officers barked about victory. At Unit 731, the panic showed not in words, but in orders. Orders to speed up, orders to destroy, orders to forget. One morning, Colonel Ishii gathered us in the yard. His coat was pressed, his voice calm, but his eyes burned with urgency. "The Emperor's command is clear," he said. "Nothing must fall into enemy hands. Not the reports, not the facilities, not the logs, not you, not us." The words twisted in my stomach. "What do you mean, not you?" That week, the experiment stopped. The cells were emptied in silence. Some logs were marched into the woods and never returned. Others were injected with poisons under the pretense of final trials. The furnaces roared night and day. Trucks came and went, loaded with crates of ledgers, jars of specimens, sealed drums that hissed when rolled too fast. We were ordered to burn, bury, erase. I was given a stack of notebooks, the same kind I'd filled with neat rows of measurements, screams reduced to numbers. The officer told me to take them to the furnace. Every page must vanish. Do not hesitate. My hands trembled as I fed the fire. Each page curled, blackened, then collapsed into ash. But the words did not vanish. I saw them burn in my mind, line by line. I heard the screams behind every stroke of ink. The smoke choked me. I coughed until tears streamed down my face. But the others didn't cough. They stood stone-faced, throwing in records of human agony, as if discarding broken tools. That night, Tanaka approached me. His face was drawn, his eyes hollow. "They won't let us leave," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "When it's finished, we're finished." I wanted to argue, to tell him we were soldiers, not prisoners. But deep down, I knew he was right. If Unit 731 erased the evidence, what were we, if not evidence ourselves? Witnesses to be silenced, logs in waiting. Every sound became a threat. The slam of boots, the creak of doors, the bark of orders. My paranoia twisted tighter with each passing hour. I slept with my rifle across my chest, though I knew it would change nothing if they came for me. On the final night, I was ordered to guard the perimeter. The compound burned behind me, orange flames licking at the sky, smoke thick enough to blot out the stars. From the distance came muffled bursts of gunfire, officers disposing of the last prisoners. The air smelled of ash and rot and fear. And then, beneath the crackle of flames, I heard it. Screams. Not distant this time. Not muffled by walls. Right there, in the dark. Dozens, maybe hundreds, rising from the smoke like a chorus. Men, women, children. The faces from my dreams, their mouths wide, their eyes locked on me. I staggered back, rifle slipping from my grip. The night seemed alive, shifting, swelling with shadows that pressed closer. My breath caught. My vision swam. I couldn't tell anymore if it was the ghosts of the logs, or if it was simply my mind breaking at last. When the all-clear whistle blew at dawn, I was still standing at the fence, trembling, unable to move. The compound was rubble, the ledgers gone, the cells empty. Nothing remained. Nothing, except the screams that clung to me like smoke. We were ordered to march out, back toward the railway. Ishii disappeared, bound for Tokyo, safe under orders of silence. The rest of us filed away like shadows, nameless, faceless, carrying nothing. But as I walked, I realized something. Unit 731 had not ended. Not for me. It would never end. The evidence may have burned, the prisoners may have vanished, the officers may have walked free, but the sound remained. I could still hear it now. Because once you write a scream into a ledger, you can never erase it. Not with fire. Not with time. Not with silence.